The thermometer nailed to her porch post read 48 below zero. Marguerite Ashwood stood at her kitchen window, watching the birch trees in the north lot split open with sounds like rifle shots. Her breath crystallized in the air before her face. It did not drift. It fell, like a fine glittering rain. She was 33 years old, a widow of 2 winters, alone on 90 acres of frozen Minnesota earth, 3 miles from the nearest neighbor. And that neighbor, she already knew, was in worse shape than she was. The radio had stopped working the day before. The road had been buried since Tuesday, and somewhere in the barn behind the house, her only milking cow was starting to shake in a way that meant she had maybe 48 hours left. But Marguerite was not afraid, not exactly. Because in the woodshed behind her, buried 10 feet beneath a floor of stacked birch and packed earth, there was a room her father had taught her how to build back in Ontario when she was 8 years old and small enough to fit inside his ice house. A room that held 42 degrees while the world above her froze solid. She placed her palm flat against the cold window pane, and she remembered his voice. The earth remembers summer longer than we do, child. You do not fight winter. You borrow what the ground already has. She turned from the window. She reached for her coat. Somewhere upstairs, her sister was already pulling on her boots. There was work to do. The year was 1907. The place was a stone ice house on the edge of Lake Simcoe, in the province of Ontario. On a July afternoon so hot, the birds had stopped singing. Marguerite Prescott was 8 years old. She stood at the top of a set of stone steps, one small hand gripping the rope railing her father had strung the summer before. Below her, the darkness smelled of straw and cold. Not the cold of winter, something older, something patient, a cold that had been waiting since February. Come down, child. Her father's voice rose up out of the dark, steady, unhurried, the way he always spoke when he was teaching her something she did not yet know she was learning. She came down. Silas Prescott was a big man, big hands, big shoulders, a beard the color of iron. He stood in the middle of the ice house floor with a lantern hooked over his thumb, and the yellow light climbed the walls behind him and made his shadow enormous. The room was full of ice. Great blocks of it, cut from the lake in January, stacked to the ceiling, wrapped in sawdust and burlap and the silence of something the world had forgotten to reclaim. It was July. Above them, the fields were burning. Below them, February was still holding on. Feel this, her father said. He placed her small palm flat against the stone wall. The wall was cool, not damp, not slick, just cool, the way a river stone feels after sunset, even in August. You know what this is, he said. Stone. No, child, this is memory. She looked up at him. She did not understand yet, but she was already trying to. The earth remembers summer longer than we do, he said, and winter longer than we can stand. It takes months to change, months, not days, not hours. Once you understand that, you stop fighting the seasons. You start borrowing what the ground already has. He crouched down beside her. He was a tall man, and he had to fold himself nearly in half to bring his eyes level with hers. Someday, he said, the world will get hard on you, and when it does, you remember this room, you remember this wall, you remember your papa's hand on top of yours. Because there is not a thing in this world colder than what you can survive. Not if you understand how the ground works. She nodded. She did not know why she nodded, but she filed it away. A lesson without a test, a truth without an occasion, a piece of knowledge that sank down into the back of her mind and stayed there, waiting for 18 years. She did not think about the ice house when she married Wendell Ashwood in the spring of 1925. She did not think about it when they boarded a rail car with 2 trunks and a wooden crate of seed potatoes and rode south across the border into the wide, flat, wind-scoured country of northern Minnesota. She did not think about it when they stood together on the porch of a small clapboard farmhouse on the banks of the Crow Wing tributary. And Wendell said the words she would remember for the rest of her life. We're home, Marguerite. Look at it. We're home. She was 26. He was 28. And beside her stood a third figure, small, slim, with clever fingers and a laugh like a small bell and a hat with a feather in it that had somehow survived the whole journey. Adelaide Prescott. Called Della since she was 4. Marguerite's half-sister, 20 years old, 6 years younger. A seamstress in the making, apprenticed for 2 years in a shop on Water Street in Peterborough. And when Marguerite had married Wendell, and when the plans for Minnesota had been made, Della had put down her scissors and her thread, and she had said, in that small, clear, unshakable voice, I am coming with you. There had been no argument. Their stepmother was dead. Their father, since the accident of 1922, was living alone in a rooming house in Peterborough, and there was nothing more the girls could do for him. Della was 20. She had no fiancé, she had no debts. She had only her clever hands and her older sister. And so, she came. They had 90 acres of honest earth, timber on the north slope, good hay ground in the low bottoms, a creek that ran clear 7 months out of the year, a barn that leaned a little to the west but still stood, and each other, the three of them, Wendell and Marguerite and Della. That was all they had, and for 5 years, it was enough. Wendell was not a big man, not like her father. He was lean and quick, and he wore spectacles when he read, which was often, because he loved almanacs and seed catalogs the way other men loved whiskey. He was patient with the horse. He was patient with the cow. He was patient with his wife. And he treated Della the way a good brother treats a younger sister, which is to say, with affection and with a firm hand when she needed one, and with laughter in the evenings when she read aloud from her novels while he mended harness. Della, for her part, took to the farm slowly. Her hands were too soft that first summer. Her back ached every night. Her boots gave her blisters. But she never complained. She learned. She learned to milk the cow. She learned to weed a row of beans. She learned to fold sheets in a wind. She kept the house clean while Marguerite worked the fields. They wanted a child, Marguerite and Wendell. They never had one. That was the first quiet grief. But they had the mornings. And the mornings were good. Coffee at the range, the smell of split birch, the sound of Wendell whistling in the barn while Marguerite kneaded bread. The particular blue of a Minnesota sky in September when the light comes in low and long and turns every stalk of grass to gold. And Della at the table sewing curtains for a window that had never had curtains, singing softly to herself in a small, clear voice. 5 years. Marguerite counted them later, on her fingers, trying to make them last. 5 years, and then, the spring of 1930. He came in from the Northfield on a cold, wet Tuesday in early April. His boots were muddy, his hair was damp. He said his chest felt heavy. Marguerite made him tea. He drank the tea. He went to bed. He did not get back up. The first 2 days, they told themselves it was a chill, the kind of thing that comes and goes when the season turns. Della kept the parlor stove burning. Marguerite made broth. They took turns wiping his forehead with a cool cloth and reading to him from the seed catalog, because it made him smile. On the third day, his fever climbed. On the fourth day, his breast started to rattle. On the fifth day, Della saddled the horse herself, and she rode 12 miles to the Halloran place, and she asked the Halloran boy to ride for the doctor. 22 miles in a spring rain. The boy came back after dark with the news that the doctor was already out on another call and would come as soon as he could. The doctor arrived on the 6th day. Wendell was already gone. Marguerite did not scream. She did not weep. She sat in the ladder back chair beside the bed with her hands folded in her lap, and she looked at his face for a long time. She looked at the small crease between his eyebrows that had appeared during his fever and had not smoothed out even in death. She looked at his mouth. She looked at the small mole on his left temple that she had kissed 1,000 times. Then she stood up. She washed her hands. She went out to the barn. She fed the horse. She fed the cow. She milked the cow. She came back inside. She washed the milk pail. Della was at the kitchen table. Della's face was in her hands. Marguerite sat down beside her. And then, only then, did she put her own face in her hands. She was 31 years old. She had no husband, no children, no mother, no father worth reaching, no family within 1,000 miles. She had 90 acres, and a woodshed, and a cow, and a horse, and a sister, and a promise she had made to a man in a bed when he could no longer hear her, that she would not leave this place. She would not sell. She would not run. She would stay. She did not know yet what that would cost her. They buried Wendell on a rise above the North Hayfield. The Halloran boys dug the grave. The Ronvik family brought a ham. Osgood Trenholm from the farm to the south did not come at all, which Marguerite noticed, and filed away, and did not mention. The service was short. The minister spoke 6 sentences. The wind came up out of the north and pulled the last words out of his mouth before Marguerite could hear them, which she thought was probably better than hearing them. She went home. She and Della sat at the kitchen table for a while. Then Marguerite went to Wendell's cabinet in the parlor, and she opened the small steel safe he kept in the bottom drawer, and she reached inside for the money they had been putting away for the dairy herd Wendell had always wanted. The safe was empty, except there was a bundle of letters tied with brown twine. In Wendell's careful block-lettered hand, she untied the twine. She read the first letter, then the second, then the third. By the time she reached the seventh, she was sitting on the parlor floor with her back against the cabinet, and she was crying in a way she had not cried at his bedside, because now she understood something she had not understood before. Wendell had been sending money home, not to his own family. His parents had passed years ago. He had no brothers. He had been sending money to hers, to her father, Silas Prescott, in Ontario, whose left leg had been taken off below the knee in the winter of 1922, when a block had come loose at the iceworks and left him alive, but ruined, whose pride had been broken worse than his body, who had sent word through a cousin that he could not face his daughters again, who had disappeared into a rooming house in Peterborough, and had lived alone for 8 years, on money her husband had been sending him, every month, without fail, without telling her, the money for the dairy herd. All of it gone for 8 years. Della came into the parlor. Della saw her sister on the floor, and the letters, and the empty safe. And Della understood before a word was spoken exactly what she was looking at, because Della had known. Della had helped Wendell address some of those letters 2 years before, when his handwriting had gotten shaky with the flu. He had asked her, and she had helped him, and he had asked her to keep the secret, because Marguerite would have refused the help, because Marguerite was proud, because Marguerite would have said, "He is not my responsibility." Not after what he did. And Wendell had said, "No, Della, he is my responsibility, because I love your sister, and because a man does not let his wife's father starve. Not even a proud, foolish man who has hidden himself for 8 years. Not on my watch." Della sat down on the floor beside her sister. She did not speak for a while. Then she said very quietly, "Marguerite, I knew." Marguerite turned her head. "You, what?" "I knew. About the letters, about Papa, about the money. Wendell asked me not to tell you. He said you would be too proud to allow it. He said Papa was our father, whether we liked it or not. And that is what family does, even when it hurts." Marguerite stared at her sister. She did not speak. She could not speak. And Della, small, clever 25-year-old Della, who had once been afraid of the dark, and who had once cried when the barn cat had kittens because they were too small to touch. Della put her arms around her older sister, and she held her, on the parlor floor, in front of an empty safe, in a farmhouse in Minnesota, in the spring of the worst year of both their lives. "Marguerite," she whispered. "What?" "I was a good man. Wendell was a good man. Do not be angry with him. He loved you. He loved us. He was a good man." Marguerite closed her eyes, and she wept. Not silently, not the way she had held herself at the bedside. She wept the way an 8-year-old weeps, with her whole body, in her sister's arms, because now finally she had permission, because now finally she was safe enough to let it out. The next morning she wrote a letter of her own, to the rooming house in Peterborough, addressed to Silas Prescott, in care of a woman named Hattie Blevins, whose name had appeared on the return address of every one of Wendell's envelopes. She did not know what to say, so she said very little. "Father, I know. Come if you can. I cannot come to you. There is no one left to run the farm." She did not sign it with love. She did not sign it at all. She sent the letter. She waited. 2 weeks later, a reply came, not from her father, from Hattie Blevins. "Miss Marguerite, your father passed on the 22nd of March of this year, 2 weeks before your husband. He asked me to write you when the time came. I am sorry. He spoke of you often. He was proud." Marguerite read the letter twice. She folded it. She handed it to Della. Della read it. Della folded it back. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. Della put the letter in the safe, with the others. Then she went to the kitchen, and she put on the kettle, because when you cannot fix anything, you make a cup of tea, which was what their mother had always said, before she had died, when they had both been very small. The offer came 3 weeks later. Osgood Trenholm was 52 years old. He owned 420 acres on the south side of the section. He wore a good wool coat and a good felt hat, and he had the kind of face that had never in its life apologized for anything. He rode up the lane on a Wednesday afternoon. He tied his horse to the post. He came up the walk with his hat in his hand. Marguerite was in the yard with a hoe. Della was in the doorway with a dish towel. Both of them stopped what they were doing. "Miss Ashwood, Mr. Trenholm, I was sorry to hear about Wendell. He was a fine man." "Thank you. I meant to come sooner." "You did not come at all." He blinked. He had not expected that. He recovered. "No," he said, "I did not. I have my reasons. I would rather not discuss them." "That is your prerogative." "Yes, it is." A silence. He cleared his throat. "Miss Ashwood, I will not waste your time. You are a woman alone. You have a sister here which is a comfort, but your sister is not a farmer. Anyone can see it. I have watched this place for 5 years. I know what Wendell was building. I know what he had in mind. And I know that without him, it cannot be done. Is that so? It is so. I am sorry to say it, but it is. And my son, and I am prepared to make you a fair offer for the 90 acres, a generous offer. I will let you keep the house and the 2 acres it stands on. And you can live here as long as you like, and I will farm the rest, and you will not have to spend another winter worrying about the hay or the herd or the woodpile. I will handle it all. He paused. He waited. She said nothing. Miss Ashwood, he said, a woman does not survive a Minnesota winter alone. It is not done. It has never been done. Not on 90 acres, not with 1 cow and 1 horse. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very softly, how much? He named a figure. It was less than half of what the land was worth. She smiled, just a little, just at the corners of her mouth. Mr. Trenholm, she said, you have wasted a trip and a good horse. Good afternoon. He stared at her. He put his hat back on. He walked to the wagon. He climbed up. He picked up the reins. And then, before he turned the horse, he looked back at her, and what he said next, she would remember for the rest of her life. You will not last one winter, Miss Ashwood. Not one. And when the ground takes you, I will buy this farm from your sister for even less than I offered today. Mark my words. He clucked to the horse. The wagon rolled down the lane. Marguerite and Della stood side by side in the yard. Neither of them moved. Della said, without looking at her sister, Marguerite, what? If he thinks that he can buy this farm from me, after what he just said, he is going to be very, very disappointed. Marguerite laughed, a short, dry, startled laugh. The first laugh she had laughed since April. That night she went out to the old root cellar behind the house. She had not been in it since Wendell died. There had been no reason. It was still full of last fall's stores, and she had been eating out of the spring house and the smokehouse because those were closer. But Osgood Trenholm's words were in her ears now. Not one winter, not one. And she needed to know. She needed to know what she was working with. She lit the lantern, she lifted the door, she went down the 8 rough-cut steps. The air inside was cool. She had brought the thermometer from the kitchen. She hung it on the nail Wendell had driven into the far wall 3 years ago. She stood in the doorway and she waited a full 10 minutes. She let the thermometer settle. Then she walked over and she looked at it and she felt her stomach drop. 38 degrees in June. She knew what that meant. She knew because Wendell had told her, and because she had lived through the winter of 1927 and lost 100 pounds of potatoes when a 3-week cold snap had driven the cellar temperature down to 22. If the cellar was 38 in June, it would be 30 in November. It would be 20 in January. It would be 15 in February. And everything in it, everything, would freeze solid. She had 200 pounds of potatoes to store this fall. She had crocks of pickled cabbage to lay up. She had lard to render. She had a hog to slaughter in November. She had meat to salt. She could not lose it. Not this year, not with the money gone. Not with Della's mouth to feed, as well as her own. She stood in the middle of the cellar with the lantern in her hand, and she looked at the fieldstone walls, and she looked at the low earth ceiling, and she thought, Wendell, you built this too shallow. You built it too small. You built it for a mild year, and now you are not here to fix it. The tears came just for a moment. She pushed them back. She climbed the steps. She closed the door. She walked back to the house. Della was in the kitchen. She looked up from her mending. You look like a ghost. I need to think. About what? About the winter. It is June. Della, please. Della lowered her mending. She waited. Marguerite went to the parlor. She sat down in Wendell's chair for the first time since he had died, and she stared at the wall. And she thought about the winter of 1927. She thought about the frozen potatoes. She thought about Osgood Trenholm's face and the way he had said not one winter, and the way his eyes had gone flat when she had told him to leave. And then, because there was nothing else left to think about, she thought about her father, Silas Prescott, the ice house on Lake Simcoe, the wall of stone, the hand on top of her hand, the lantern light on his beard. The earth remembers summer longer than we do. She sat up so fast that the chair creaked under her. Because if her father could keep ice through July using a stone room and packed sawdust and burlap and darkness, then the same principle, the exact same principle, should work in reverse. If a stone room buried deep enough could hold the cold of February all the way through August. Then a stone room buried deep enough could hold the warmth of August all the way through February. Same principle. Opposite direction. She stood up. She walked to the parlor cabinet. She pulled open the bottom drawer. She reached past the empty safe. She reached to the very back, and she pulled out a small, battered, leather-bound book. Her father's field book. He had mailed it to her in the summer of 1922 after the accident, with a note that said only, in case you ever need it, SP. She had kept it in a drawer for nearly 8 years. She had never opened it, because opening it had felt too much like forgiving him, and she had not been ready. She opened it now. She sat down at the kitchen table with the lantern beside her, and she opened the field book. And she turned the pages one by one, and she read her father's careful, blocky handwriting, and she looked at his diagrams, and she looked at his measurements, and she found, on page 47, a drawing. A drawing of an ice house, stone-lined, 9 feet deep, roofed with plank and so ventilated with a small pipe and a damper. Insulated with hay above and packed earth below. Beside the drawing in her father's hand, holds ice from January to August. Never fails. SP 1898. She stared at the drawing for a long time. Then she laughed, just once. Just a small, dry, disbelieving laugh. Then she went to find Della. You want to what? You heard me. Marguerite, you want to dig a hole in the ground under the woodshed. 10 feet deep. Yes. By hand. By hand. You and me. You and me. Della sat down at the kitchen table. She put her forehead in her hands. Marguerite. What? Marguerite, I am a seamstress from Peterborough who has been pretending to be a farmer for 5 years. I can milk a cow. I can fold sheets. I have never in my life dug anything larger than a flower bed. And I will tell you honestly, Marguerite, the flower bed was a disaster. Marguerite almost smiled. Almost. Della. What? You are not just a seamstress anymore. You are a woman who saddled a horse in the rain and rode 12 miles for a doctor. Do not sell yourself short. Della lifted her head. She looked at her sister across the table. She looked at her sister for a very long time. You are serious, she said. I have never been more serious about anything. You will hurt yourself. Possibly. You will fail. Possibly. You will freeze to death this winter, and I will have to bury you, and I will have to spend the rest of my life knowing my sister died in a hole in the ground because she would not sell her farm to a rude man in a wool coat. That is one possible outcome. Yes. Della sat back in her chair. She let out a breath. She did not speak for a while. Then she said very quietly, "Show me the book." Marguerite pushed the field book across the table. Della opened it. She turned the pages, slowly, carefully, with her seamstress fingers. She looked at the drawing on page 47. She read Silas Prescott's careful handwriting. She traced the lines of the stone walls with the tip of her finger. Papa drew this, when I was not even born. Before you were even born. Della closed the book, gently. She kept her hand on the cover. Marguerite, she said, may I ask you something? Yes. Are you doing this because of Papa, or because of Wendell, or because of Osgood Trenholm, or because of the potatoes? Marguerite thought about it. She thought about it for a long time. All of them, she said, and none of them. I am doing it because I remember my father's hand on top of mine when I was 8 years old. And he told me the earth remembers summer longer than we do, and I have carried that in the back of my head for 18 years without knowing why. And now I know why. Della nodded. Slowly, she stood up. She walked over to the pantry. She opened it. She looked at the shelves. She counted the jars. She counted the sacks of flour. She counted the tin of coffee. She came back to the table. How much of what we need can we grow ourselves? Most of it. How much do we have to buy? Coffee, sugar, salt, kerosene, not much else. Can we make it through a winter without going to town? If the cellar holds. And if the cellar does not hold. We die or we sell, whichever comes first. Della stared at her. Then she did something Marguerite did not expect. She laughed. A short, startled, high-pitched laugh, just once. And then she covered her mouth, and her eyes filled, and she shook her head. Marguerite Ashwood, she said, you are the most terrifying woman I have ever known, and I lived with our stepmother. Is that a yes? That is a yes. God help me. That is a yes. They spent August preparing. There were tools to gather, a long-handled spade, a mattock, a wheelbarrow, a pry bar, a handpick, a wooden mallet, a set of chisels she found in Wendell's tool chest that had belonged to his own father. There were stones to haul. Marguerite spent 7 afternoons that August walking the creek bed with the wagon, picking flat field stones the size of dinner plates, loading them by hand, driving them back to the woodshed. She hauled 200 pounds of stone in total. It nearly killed the horse. There were bales of hay to earmark, 15 bales set aside from the second, cutting the driest and cleanest of them tied and stacked in the loft where they would stay until she needed them. There was canvas to source. Marguerite drove to town in the middle of August, and she bought 40 feet of waxed grain cover canvas from the general store. The clerk raised an eyebrow. She did not explain. She paid in cash. She loaded the canvas in the back of the wagon, and she drove home. The clerk mentioned it later to another customer. The other customer mentioned it later to Osgood Trenholm. Osgood Trenholm did not say anything at the time. He simply nodded, and then he asked in a quiet voice whether anyone had seen a delivery of lumber to the Ashwood place, or any tools, or any hired hands. The answer was no. Good Trenholm smiled, just a little. He said, "That woman is losing her mind. Buying canvas in August. What in God's name for?" And the two men laughed, because it was a strange purchase, and because there is a particular kind of pleasure certain men take in the strangeness of a woman living alone. Marguerite did not know about the laugh, but she would have expected it if she had. She did not care. She was busy. By the first week of September, the summer was gone. The mornings had teeth. The birch leaves along the north lot were yellowing at the edges. The high geese had started south in long, high honking V's against a sky that had already begun to turn from cornflower to slate. Marguerite stood in the woodshed on the morning of September the 10th. She had a spade in her hands. Della stood behind her, with a mattock, in Wendell's old boots, in a pair of Marguerite's canvas trousers cut down and hemmed, with her hair braided back, with her jaw set. Marguerite looked at her sister. Della looked back at her. "Ready," Marguerite said. "No," Della said. "But when has that ever mattered?" Marguerite laughed, a real laugh, the second real laugh she had laughed since April. She turned to the marked-out rectangle on the shed floor. 9 feet by 14 feet, chalked in white lime on the packed dirt. Her father's dimensions, adjusted for her needs. She raised the spade. She held it there, for just a moment. She heard her father's voice, very clearly, as if he were standing right behind her. "You do not fight, winter child." She drove the spade into the earth. The first cut was clean, black topsoil, loose, rich, smelling of roots and old rain. She lifted the spadeful. She set it aside. She drove the spade in again. And behind her, without a word, Della raised the mattock and swung it, and the point bit deep. And the two Prescott women, 2 women alone in a woodshed, on a farm they had been told they could not keep, in a country that had been told a widow could not survive, in a season that was already turning, began to dig. The first day of digging, they went down 2 feet. The second day, 3. The third day, 4.5. On the fourth day, it rained, and the hole filled with 6 inches of muddy water, and Marguerite spent the entire morning bailing it out with a tin bucket, while Della in the loft sewed a canvas tarp large enough to cover the pit at night, because they had not thought of that, because neither of them had ever dug a hole for a living, because there were 100 things they had not thought of, and they were about to learn every single one of them the hard way. By the end of the first week, they had a pit 6 feet deep, 9 feet wide, 14 feet long. By the end of the second week, they had 8 feet. By the end of the third week, they had 9. And Marguerite stood at the top of the ladder they had rigged out of pine planks and rope, and she looked down into the dark of it, and she thought, one more foot, and we hit 10, and we start on the stones. She did not know. She did not know that the 10th foot would nearly kill her sister. It was a Thursday morning, the 25th of September. The sky was flat and gray, and there was a wind out of the northwest that smelled like snow, even though it was too early for snow. Not by much, but too early. Marguerite was at the top of the ladder. She was hauling up the wheelbarrow load. She had rigged a pulley from the crossbeam of the shed. The system worked, barely. Della was at the bottom. She was breaking hardpan with the mattock. The last foot was clay, the hardest layer, dense as brick. She had been swinging the mattock for 2 hours. Her arms were trembling. She should have stopped an hour ago. She did not stop, because she was Della Prescott, and she was going to prove something. To herself, to Marguerite, to Osgood Trenholm, to every voice that had ever whispered that a seamstress from Peterborough could not become a woman who mattered. She was going to prove she could finish what she started. She swung the mattock, the point bit deep. She braced her foot on the wall to lever it back out. The wall, which had been dry for 3 weeks, which had held its shape through the rain, which had seemed as solid as any earth ever seemed. The wall gave way. A slab of subsoil the size of a kitchen table sheared off from the north face of the pit and came down on top of her. Marguerite heard the sound. She would remember it for the rest of her life. A wet, heavy sighing crack, like the world breaking open. And then a thud, and then silence. She was down the ladder in 8 seconds, which she would not have believed possible later when she tried to think about it. She was 31 years old. She was in Wendell's oversized boots. She was down the ladder in 8 seconds, and she was in the pit, and she was digging with her bare hands. Della. No answer. Della. 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 She found her sister's shoulder first, then her braid, then her face. Della's face was turned to the side, half-buried mouth, full of dirt, eyes closed. Marguerite scooped the dirt out of her mouth with her fingers. She turned her sister's head. She pressed her ear to her sister's chest. Beating, breathing, shallow, wet, uneven, but breathing. Della, Della, open your eyes, Della. Della's eyes fluttered, then opened, then went wide. Then filled with a pain so pure and so total that Marguerite understood in that single instant that her sister was hurt in a way that could not be argued with, could not be worked around, could not be shrugged off, could not be dismissed. Della tried to speak. Nothing came out except a small, ragged wheeze. Marguerite understood then. The ribs. It was the ribs. Do not move. Do not. I am going to lift you out. Do you hear me? Do not try to help. Della did not try to help. She could not have if she wanted to. Marguerite dug the rest of the way with her hands. She freed Della's legs. She freed Della's other arm. Then in a single careful, agonizing motion, she lifted her sister, all 110 pounds of her, up out of the collapsed corner of the pit, onto the ladder, up the ladder, one rung at a time, with Della's face against her shoulder, and Della's breath coming in short, wet, broken gasps. She got her sister to the top. She got her sister across the yard. She got her sister into the house. She got her sister onto the bed, Wendell's bed, the bed she had not slept in since April. And then Marguerite Ashwood sat down on the floor, and she pressed her hands to her face. And for one long, terrible moment, she did nothing at all. Because she did not know what to do. Because there was no doctor for 40 miles. Because the closest neighbor was 3 miles away, and the closest telephone was in town, and it was 9 miles to town on a good day. And this was not a good day. And she was 31 years old, and her sister was dying, and there was nobody. Nobody coming. Then she took her hands off her face, and she got up, and she got to work. She had never set a rib. She had watched her mother set one once on a farmhand who had fallen off a hayrick in Ontario. She had been 7 years old. She remembered the wide muslin bandages. She remembered the small board her mother had padded with quilt batting and pressed against the man's side. She remembered her mother saying, "Not too tight, child. He has to breathe, but snug, snug enough that the bone knows where to go." Marguerite tore a bedsheet into strips. She patted a piece of pine board with quilt batting. She unbuttoned her sister's shirt with fingers that would not stop shaking. She counted the ribs, 2 of them. On the left side, below the breast, she could feel the ends where they were not supposed to be. She could feel the small, sharp, awful click. When Della drew a breath, Della was awake. Della was watching her. Della's eyes were very large and very calm, calmer than Marguerite's. "Do it," Della whispered. "It will hurt." "Marguerite, do it." She did it. Della did not scream. She made a sound, a single high strangled sound, that Marguerite would hear in her dreams for the rest of her life. Then Della fainted, which was Marguerite thought a mercy. She wrapped the bandages, snug, not too tight. She placed the padded board. She tied the strips. She lifted her sister's head. She slid a folded pillow beneath her shoulders. Because Della had to be propped up. Because ribs healed better when the chest was slightly raised. Then she sat down beside the bed, and she did not move for 6 hours. She did not eat. She did not drink. She did not tend the cow. She did not stoke the stove. She sat. She watched her sister breathe. Because that was all she could do. And in her head, over and over, on a loop she could not stop. She thought, "I did this. I asked her to dig, and now she is going to die. In a farmhouse. On the Crow Wing. Because I was too stubborn to sell." She thought that over and over for 6 hours. And then Della opened her eyes, and she looked at Marguerite, and she said, in a small, hoarse, papery voice, "You are being dramatic." Marguerite stared at her. "What?" "I can see your face. You are being dramatic. Stop it. I am not going to die. Della, I am going to lie here, and I am going to heal, and you are going to finish digging the hole. Without me, and I do not want to hear one more word about it. Is that clear?" Della, you cannot possibly. You have to rest. I am resting. This is me resting. Marguerite, go. Go finish. Because if you stop now, if you stop because of me, then I did this for nothing. And I did not do this for nothing. Marguerite could not speak. She reached for her sister's hand. Della let her take it. They sat like that, in the failing light of a September evening, for a long time, neither of them saying anything, because there was nothing left to say, except one thing, which Della said, just before she drifted off to sleep again. She said, very quietly, Papa would have been so proud of you today. Marguerite closed her eyes, and she cried, silently, so her sister would not hear, until Della's breathing evened out, and Marguerite knew she was asleep. And she got up, and she went to the kitchen, and she washed her face at the basin, and she wiped it dry, and she walked out to the woodshed, alone, and she picked up the mattock. She dug for 18 days, alone. She checked on Della every 2 hours. She fed her broth. She helped her to the chamber pot. She read to her in the evenings from the almanac. She sang to her, sometimes softly, songs their mother had sung when they were girls. Della slept most of the time. She healed slowly, but she healed. And in the meantime, Marguerite finished the hole. She reached 10 feet on the 2nd of October. She began laying the stone floor on the 5th. She built the fair on the 9th, a great roaring 3-hour bonfire in the field at the edge of the woodshed. She stacked the flat stones in it. She let them heat until they were almost too hot to look at. Then she wrapped each one in burlap, and she carried them one by one into the pit, and she laid the floor. Warm stone against warm sand against warm earth. Because a stone floor that started its life at 200 degrees would not surrender that warmth for weeks. She built the roof on the 15th, rough pine planks, 6 inches thick, laid across the 10-foot span in 2 sections. Supported by a beam she had mortised into notches cut into the stone walls with a chisel and a mallet. She packed the hay above the planks on the 16th, 4 inches, compressed by hand. She stretched the wax canvas on the 17th, overlapping the edges a full foot on each side, tucking them down, sealing them. She shoveled 12 inches of subsoil on top on the 18th, pressed into a low arch, smoothed with her hands and her feet, and on the 19th, she restacked the birch. Every split piece returned to exactly where it had been, the rows neat and ordinary, the hatch concealed beneath the 3rd row from the right, a 2-foot square of pine planks, lifted on a leather pull strap, invisible, unless you knew what you were looking for, and nobody did. Nobody except Marguerite Ashwood and Adelaide Prescott, who was that afternoon sitting up in bed for the first time in 3 weeks, and drinking a cup of chicken broth, and asking in a voice that was still hoarse but no longer papery whether the hole was done. It is done, Marguerite said. Show me. Della, you cannot walk that far yet. I can walk that far, Marguerite Ashwood, or I can crawl, your choice. Marguerite carried her. Della stood at the top of the 8-cut earth steps. She held the lantern in her one good hand. The other arm was still bound to her side. Her face was pale. Her braid was undone and hanging loose over one shoulder. She had lost weight. She looked, Marguerite thought, like a small, wounded, exhausted thing. She also looked, Marguerite thought, like the most beautiful sight she had ever seen. Della lifted the lantern. The light climbed the fieldstone walls. She looked at the floor. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the way the pine beam sat in its stone mortise. She looked at the smoothness of the packed subsoil arch above her. She did not speak for a long time. Then she said very softly, Papa built this. No, Della, I built this. No, I mean, Papa taught you to build this, and you built it, and now it is standing, and it is beautiful. And Papa is dead, but this is standing. Do you understand what I am saying? Marguerite did. She said nothing. She just stood there in the lantern light at the bottom of a 10-foot hole under a woodshed in northern Minnesota. And she let her sister say the thing that neither of them had been able to say out loud in all the months since the letter from Hattie Blevins had come. Their father was dead, but something of him, some careful, blocky, patient thing, was still in the world because they had put it here. 2 days later, Osgood Trenholm rode up the lane. Marguerite was in the yard when he came. She had a wheelbarrow of the last of the excavated soil, and she was dumping it in the low spot at the edge of the hayfield. She had been dumping soil in that low spot for 6 weeks. It was starting to level out. She saw him coming. She set down the wheelbarrow. She wiped her hands on her apron. She did not go to meet him. She let him come to her. He rode up to the fence. He did not dismount. Miss Ashwood. Mr. Trenholm. He looked at the mound of subsoil. He looked at the woodshed. He looked at Marguerite. He smiled. Just a little. The smile of a man who has been waiting for something for months and has finally been rewarded. Digging a grave, Miss Ashwood. She looked at him. She waited a beat. Then she said, in a voice so calm and so mild that even she was surprised by it, "Yes, Mr. Trenholm. As a matter of fact, I am." He blinked. "I beg your pardon." "A grave, Mr. Trenholm, for the idea that a woman alone cannot survive a winter on 90 acres of honest Minnesota earth. I am digging that idea a grave, and I am going to bury it very deep, right here, under this woodshed, where I can keep an eye on it." Was there anything else? He stared at her. He did not answer immediately. Then he touched the brim of his hat, not politely, sarcastically. "Good luck to you, Miss Ashwood," he said. "You will need it." He turned his horse. He rode away. Marguerite watched him go, and in her head, very quietly, she thought, that man is going to try something. Before this winter is over, I do not know what, but something. She picked up the wheelbarrow. She went back to work. The offering came the following afternoon. It was a Sunday. She was in the yard splitting the last of the birch when she heard the wagon. She looked up. It was Emmett Ronvik. Emmett Ronvik was 68 years old. He was a third-generation Norwegian farmer, 3 miles east on the same section road. He was a widower. He kept to himself. He rarely spoke. When he did speak, it was worth listening. Marguerite had met him twice. Both times he had nodded and touched his hat and said very little. She set down the axe. She walked over to the wagon. He did not dismount. He looked down at her from the wagon seat. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached behind him, and he lifted out of the wagon bed a coil of rope. Thick, new, the kind of hemp rope that costs a full week's grocery money in a hard year. He set it on the ground beside her. Then he lifted out a box of 8-penny nails, full, unopened. Then he lifted out a spade, a brand new sharp-edged, long-handled spade. He set them all on the ground in a small, neat pile at her feet. He looked at her. He said, very quietly, "Ma'am." That was all. He clucked to his horse. He turned the wagon in the yard. He drove away. Marguerite stood in the yard with a rope and a box of nails and a spade at her feet. And she watched Emmett Ronvik's wagon disappear down the lane, and her eyes filled, and she blinked the tears back, because she did not have time to cry, but she understood. She understood exactly what had just happened. Emmett Ronvik had not come to help. He had not come to lecture. He had not come to warn her. He had not come to buy her farm. I had come to say, I see you, and I know what you are doing, and you are not alone. She picked up the rope. She picked up the nails. She picked up the spade. She carried them to the woodshed. She did not say anything to Della about it. Not then, not for months, but she would remember it for the rest of her life. She provisioned the cellar in the last week of October. 200 pounds of potatoes in burlap sacks, lowered by rope, 80 pounds of turnips, 4 crocks of salted pork, sealed with rendered fat, 12-quart jars of pickled cabbage, 2 crocks of lard, 50 pounds of cornmeal, in a cedar box with a tight sealing lid, 6 dozen eggs, packed in oats, 3 braids of onions, 1 tin containing $60 in paper money, wrapped twice in oilcloth. Everything she had left, everything she owned, everything that stood between her and starvation, 10 feet down, under her own woodshed, where no one would think to look. She stood at the top of the earth steps when she was finished. She held the lantern. She looked down at what she had built. She thought, that is a whole winter, Marguerite. That is a whole winter, and then some. She closed the hatch. She restacked the birch. She walked back to the house. Della was at the kitchen window, wrapped in a shawl, still healing, still thin, but upright and smiling. Done, young. And now what? Now we wait. The winter of 1930 into 1931 was gentle. That was the word for it. Gentle. It came in soft. It stayed soft. The coldest morning of January was 12 below. The average day was 15 above. The snow came in reasonable quantities and left in reasonable quantities. Marguerite did not let herself relax. She checked the cellar every 7 days. She kept a small notebook with a pencil tied to it with string hanging on a nail beside the hatch. Every visit she recorded the temperature. At 12 below, outside the cellar was 42. At 5 below, outside the cellar was 42. At 2 above, outside the cellar was 42. The cellar was always 42. She wrote it down. Because someone, someday, might want to know. Della healed. By Christmas, she could raise her left arm above her head. By New Year's, she could carry a bucket. By February, she could split kindling. By March, she was sewing again. She sewed heavy work trousers for Marguerite. From a bolt of duck canvas Marguerite had brought back from town. She lined them with soft flannel. She added double reinforcement at the knees. She sewed mittens, wool outer sheepskin inner, long cuffs that came up over the wrist. She sewed a hood, a proper hood, lined with rabbit fur she had scavenged from an old coat of Wendell's. Every time Marguerite put on one of these garments, Della watched her with a small, private smile. Every time Marguerite went out into a Minnesota morning wearing them, she thought, my sister has saved my life today, without either of us having to say it. The spring came, the summer came, the garden went in, the hay was cut. The cellar was emptied of last year's stores and swept clean and refilled with the new season's provisions. The stone floor still held its warmth. Marguerite tested it in July, 61 degrees, in a room 10 feet under the earth. In the middle of a Minnesota summer, she wrote it in the notebook. She underlined it. She thought, Papa, you would have loved to see this. And then, in the second week of September 1931, Osgood Trenholm made his move. He came up the lane on a Tuesday afternoon. He was dressed for business. Dark coat, good boots, a leather satchel under one arm. Marguerite was in the yard. She was mending a piece of fence. She kept mending it. Miss Ashwood, Mr. Trenholm, I have some papers for you from the county assessor. She looked up. Papers. Regarding the tax status of this property. She wiped her hands. She took the papers. She read them. They were on official letterhead. They bore what appeared to be an official seal. They stated that Marguerite Ashwood, widow of Wendell Ashwood, was in arrears on her property taxes for the years 1930 and 1931 in the amount of $218. They stated that failure to pay within 30 days would result in a tax sale of the property. They stated that the county was prepared to accept a settlement from a qualified adjacent landowner at a reduced rate. The qualified adjacent landowner was named. The name was Osgood Trenholm. Marguerite read papers twice. She looked up at him. He was smiling. You may want to consult a lawyer, Miss Ashwood, he said, but I have already spoken with the assessor's office, and they have assured me that this is a legitimate document. My offer, of course, still stands. It would spare you a great deal of unpleasantness. He waited. She said nothing. He touched his hat. I will give you a week to consider. Good afternoon, Miss Ashwood. He mounted his horse. He rode away. Marguerite stood in the yard with the papers in her hand. Her heart was pounding. Her mind was very still. Because she knew she had paid every tax bill Wendell had ever received. She had paid the 1930 bill herself in November of 1930 with money from the sale of the summer hay. She had a receipt. She had it in the tin in the cellar right now. The papers in her hand were forgeries. She took a breath. She folded the papers. She walked into the house. She sat down at the kitchen table, and she wrote a letter to the office of the Crow Wing County Assessor, in care of the County Board of Commissioners. Not the assessor himself, the commissioners. Della came in. Who was that? Osgood Trenholm. What did he want? He wants our farm. Marguerite. Della, sit down. I have to concentrate. Della sat down. She watched her sister write. Marguerite wrote for 20 minutes. Then she folded the letter. She sealed it with wax. She stood up. She put on her coat. She put on her hood. Where are you going? To town. Now. Marguerite, it is 4 in the afternoon. Then it will be dark by the time I get there. What did that man do? Marguerite looked at her sister. She held up the folded papers. He tried to steal our farm, Della, with a piece of paper, and he thought I would be too frightened, or too proud, or too stupid to check. Della's eyes went wide, then slowly, they narrowed. Marguerite, she said, what? Bring me back some ribbon from the general store, blue, 2 yards. Marguerite stared at her. Ribbon for a hat when we bury that man in the county courthouse. I want to be wearing a new hat. Marguerite laughed. She could not help it. She laughed a real sharp, delighted laugh. Then she went to the barn. She saddled the horse. She rode to town. She slept in the loft of a livery stable. She paid the stable boy a dime. She was at the courthouse door at 7 the next morning before it opened. She was the first person through the door when it did open. She spoke to the county recorder, then to the county clerk, then at 10:30 in the morning to the assessor himself. Willard Hetch was 60 years old. He had a bald head and thick spectacles. He looked at the papers she brought. He looked at the receipt she brought. He read both twice. Then he looked up at her. He said, very quietly, Miss Ashwood, these papers did not come from my office. I know. Then why did you ride 9 miles to bring them to me? Because I want the county commissioners to know that a private citizen is forging official county documents. in an attempt to defraud a widow out of 90 acres of land, and I want them to know it publicly, in writing, before a court reporter, so that it cannot be denied later. Willard Hetch looked at her over his spectacles. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice so soft she almost did not hear it, Miss Ashwood, come with me, please, right now. She went with him. The public reprimand of Osgood Trenholm was issued at the next meeting of the Crow Wing County Board of Commissioners, which took place on the following Thursday, which was attended by unusual coincidence by more than 60 local farmers and townspeople. Word had gotten around. Word always gets around. Osgood Trenholm was not present. The reprimand was read aloud into the public record by the chairman of the board. It named Osgood Trenholm by name. It stated that any further attempt by Mr. Trenholm to interfere with the Ashwood property would be referred immediately to the county prosecutor for criminal charges of fraud. Marguerite Ashwood was present. She sat in the third row. She wore her best black wool dress. Her hair was pinned up. Her hands were folded in her lap. Beside her sat Adelaide Prescott, wearing a new hat with a blue ribbon, 2 yards of it, woven around the crown in a small, elegant loop. When the reprimand was finished, Marguerite stood. She did not speak. She did not have to. Every farmer in the room was looking at her. Some of them nodded. Some of them did not. One of them in the very back row tipped his hat. Emmett Ronvik, who had come 9 miles into town for a meeting he did not need to attend, because he had wanted to be there. Marguerite tipped her head in return. Just once. Then she took her sister's arm and she walked out of that courthouse into a September afternoon in the year of our Lord, 1931, with her back very straight and her chin very high. October passed. November came. The birch dropped their leaves in a rush. The high geese went south. The creek froze in the second week. The wind came up out of the northwest and it did not stop. Marguerite and Della prepared. They chinked the north wall of the house. They oiled every leather strap in the barn. They split the last of the summer wood. They built the wood pile to 4 full cords. They stocked the pantry. They laid extra hay in the barn. They stocked the cellar to the ceiling. The first cold snap came the second week of December. 14 below, held for 3 days. The cellar read 41 on the third morning. The second cold snap came at Christmas. 19 below. The cellar read 41. The third came on the 8th of January, 1932. 22 below. The cellar read 40. Marguerite wrote it in her notebook. She underlined it. She stood at the top of the earth steps in the lantern light, and she looked down at what she and her sister had built. She did not know what was coming. She did not know that the Arctic air mass sliding south out of the Canadian Shield was the coldest to reach this valley in her lifetime there. She did not know that within 3 days the temperature at her porch would drop to 38 below, then 42 below, then 48 below, and it would stay there for 14 straight days. The radio would call it a lockdown. The livestock in that valley would begin to fail. The cellars would begin to freeze. She did not know. She did not know that in a house 3 miles to the south, a 10-year-old girl named Lucinda Trenholm was about to make a decision. That would change everything. Not yet. For now, on this particular evening, in the second week of January 1932, Marguerite Ashwood stood in her kitchen. She looked out the window. She watched the snow come down in the last of the failing light. Della was at the table, sewing a patch onto a work sock. The kettle was on the stove. Marguerite turned from the window. She sat down at the table. She reached across the table, and she took her sister's hand. Della looked up. What is it? Nothing, Della. I just wanted to hold your hand for a minute. Della looked at her for a long moment. Then she set down the sock, and she took her sister's other hand, and they sat there, in the lamplight, in the kitchen, 2 sisters, alone, together, while outside the window, coming down from the north, winter was coming. The first morning of the cold snap, it was 38 below. Marguerite stood on the porch in Wendell's sheepskin coat. She held the thermometer in her mittened hand. She had unhooked it from the porch post to bring it inside, just to be sure, just to double check, because 38 below was not a number you accepted on faith. The mercury was where it was. She took it inside anyway. Della was at the stove, making oatmeal. How bad? 38 below. Marguerite, I know. That is not January cold. That is February cold. Deep February cold. I know, Della. And it is only the 11th. I know. Della stirred the oatmeal. She did not speak for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, is the cellar still holding? I have not checked yet this morning. Check it. Marguerite went out. She crossed the yard, her breath falling in bright, glittering flakes in the air in front of her face. She moved aside the birch. She lifted the hatch. She climbed down the 8 earth steps. She held her bare hand at chest height. She waited. 42. She smiled. Just a little. She climbed back up. She restacked the birch. She walked back to the house. Well, 42. In the ground. In the ground, under the woodshed, yes. Della let out a long breath. She turned back to the stove. Papa, she said, very softly, to no one in particular. Papa, you were a genius, and you never even knew it. The second morning, 42 below. The third morning, 45 below. The fourth morning, 47 below. The fifth morning, 48 below, and it held. Day after day, morning after morning, Marguerite would rise before first light. She would go to the porch. She would look at the thermometer, and the number would not have changed. Or it would have gotten colder, never warmer, 48 below, the kind of cold that changes what air is. Because at 48 below, air is not air. Air is a substance. It hurts to breathe. It pulls the moisture from your eyes. It freezes the small hairs inside your nose within seconds of stepping outside. It turns your breath into a shower of ice crystals that fall to the ground before they can drift. The birch trees in the north lot began to crack. They cracked like rifle shots. They cracked all night long, every night, because the sap inside the frozen wood expanded faster than the fiber could hold. So the trees split, along the grain, from the base to the crown, in sounds so loud and so sharp that Della woke gasping on the third night, and she came into Marguerite's room, wrapped in a quilt, and she crawled into bed beside her sister, like she had done when she was 5 years old, and she was afraid of the thunder. The thunder. Marguerite held her. She did not say anything. The trees cracked. Every hour or two. All night. Every night. For 14 nights. They rationed 2 loads to the parlor stove per day. Not 3. The kitchen range only during cooking. And for the 1 hour after, the small box stove in the bedroom banked low and burning slowly all night, because if the water in the bucket froze, they were in real trouble. The wood was going faster than Marguerite had planned for. She checked the woodshed on the morning of the 6th day. She counted the cords by eye. She did the mental arithmetic. Then she did it again, because the first time the answer had scared her, at the current rate. And they would run out in 9 days, which meant they had to cut consumption. Now, she banked the parlor stove that night. She let it burn down. She and Della slept in the kitchen, both of them, in quilts, on the floor, with the range banked and burning slowly and the water bucket right beside them. Della did not complain. The 6th morning, the cow started to fail. Her name was Juno. She was a Guernsey, 6 years old, in her prime. Marguerite had checked her 3 times a day since the cold snap began. She had brought her warm water from the kitchen range. She had added extra hay. Now Juno was standing at the back wall of the barn with her head lowered. Her breath was coming in short, thin, quick pulls. Her legs were spread. Her weight was shifted forward. And when Marguerite pressed her palm against the animal's flank, the warmth she felt there was thin. Too thin. The thermometer on the center post of the barn read 9 degrees above zero. 9. At 48 below outside, with the wind coming steady out of the north, through the 4-foot gap between the barn and the woodshed, which she and Wendell had always meant to close, and never had. 9 degrees. Juno had maybe 48 hours, maybe less. Marguerite stood in the barn doorway. She looked at the cow. She looked at the woodshed. She looked at the gap between the 2 buildings. She looked at the wind, which she could see, because it was carrying snow in long, low, sideways ribbons. Right through the gap, straight across the yard. She stood there for a long time. She thought about her father. She thought about the ice house. She thought about the specific thing he had said in the ice house, when she had asked him once why the ice did not melt on the very hottest day of July. Because it is not the temperature that kills ice, child. It is the movement of the air. Still air holds. Moving air steals. If you want to save something, anything, you stop the wind first. The heat comes second, but the wind comes first. She turned around. She walked back to the house. Della, what? Put on everything you own. Everything. Everything. Right now, we are going outside for a long time. They dressed the way she remembered her father dressing on the coldest February mornings in Ontario. 2 pairs of wool stockings, Wendell's canvas trousers over Marguerite's flannel skirt. 2 shirts, a wool sweater, Wendell's sheepskin coat over Marguerite's own wool coat, the rabbit fur hood, the mittens Della had made. Wool scarves wound 3 times around the mouth and nose. Wendell's felt-lined pack boots on both of them, stuffed with wool socks. They looked like Arctic explorers. They felt, Della said, like they might survive the walk to the barn, which was not a joke, because it was 46 below, and the wind was steady at 15 miles an hour, which meant exposed skin would freeze in 90 seconds, not 5 minutes, 90 seconds. They went out. They worked. They dragged 2 full bales of hay from the loft. They unwired them. They opened them up, and they packed the hay into the gap between the barn and the woodshed, compressed, stacked, filled from the ground up to the height of the eaves. They stretched a section of waxed canvas, 12 feet long. Marguerite had saved it from the cellar roof project 18 months ago, which she had not thrown away, because Marguerite Ashwood did not throw things away. They wrapped the canvas around the hay bales, and they nailed it to the wooden walls of the barn and the woodshed on both sides with 8-penny nails and a hammer that kept slipping out of Marguerite's mittened hand because her fingers had stopped working properly around mine at 40. They braced the whole assembly with 4 lengths of 2x6 rough sawn pine. From the shed rafters, they worked for an hour and 20 minutes. Della's fingers went numb twice. Both times, Margaret took her sister's hands and she pressed them against the cow's neck. She held them there until the joints came back. And Della winced, and she gasped, because coming back is worse than going numb. Coming back is when the pain arrives. Della did not cry. She did not complain. She stood with her cheek against Juno's warm side. She waited for her fingers, and when they were working again, she went back to hammering nails with her sister in a Minnesota barn in minus 46 degrees on a Tuesday afternoon. They finished at 3:15 in the afternoon. Marguerite stepped back. She looked at what they had built. It was not pretty. It was a wall of hay and canvas and lumber, stuffed and tied and nailed into a 4-foot gap. It looked like a large, ugly bandage, but it stopped the wind. She could feel the difference immediately. The barn, which had been a wind tunnel, was suddenly still. The moving air, which had been stealing warmth as fast as the cow could produce, it was gone, and the still air was starting to hold. She checked the thermometer on the barn post. 10 degrees. She waited 15 minutes. 11. She waited another 15. 12. Della was in the barn with her, watching, not speaking, because she could see it too. By 4 o'clock, the barn was 13 degrees. By 4:30, 14. Juno raised her head. She took a step. She took another. She walked slowly, deliberately to the hay rack. She began to eat. Marguerite stood in the barn doorway, her hood down around her shoulders, her hair sweat damp against her forehead, her cheeks flushed, her breath coming in long, ragged clouds. Della came up beside her. They stood there together for a long moment. Then Della said, in a small, shaky, wondering voice, "We just did that, didn't we? We just did that. 2 women in a wind. 2 women in a wind, yes." Della started to laugh. She laughed, a strange, high, gasping laugh. And then she was crying, and then she was laughing again, and then she was crying and laughing at the same time. And Marguerite pulled her sister into her arms, and they held each other there, in the doorway of a barn, in the middle of a Minnesota afternoon, in a cold so severe it should have killed them both. And they had not been killed. Not yet. They had bought their cow 48 more hours. Maybe more. Maybe enough. The 7th day of the cold snap. The 8th. The 9th. The 10th. The temperature did not break, and the wind did not stop. The trees kept cracking. Marguerite kept a fire. She kept the water bucket liquid. She kept Juno fed. She kept the cellar checked. She kept the woodpile measured. The wood was going to hold, barely. Because of the barn wall project. Because they had stopped losing heat through the wall, she now realized had always been leaking. Because Della had noticed on the 8th day that the kitchen was warmer than it had been on the 3rd. Because still air holds. They were going to make it. She began to allow herself to believe it, which is, of course, exactly the wrong moment to believe anything. Because that is when Lucinda came. It was the 12th night of the cold snap. The wind had come up again sometime after dark. Not a gale, just a steady, mean 12-mile-an-hour push out of the north. The temperature at the porch post read 46 below. Marguerite and Della were in the kitchen. They were eating a late supper, salt pork and boiled potatoes and coffee. The range was banked low. The lamp was turned down to save kerosene. The only sound in the house was the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional distant crack of a birch tree in the north lot. The knock came at 10:23 at night. Marguerite would remember the time, because she looked at the clock, because the sound was so small and so weak that at first she thought it was the wind against the porch step. Then it came again. 2 knocks, very light, very slow. Marguerite stood up. Della stood up. Wait, Marguerite, do not open the door without a lamp. Bring the lamp. Marguerite crossed the kitchen. Della followed her. Marguerite unlatched the door. She opened it. There was a child on the porch, a girl, 10 years old. She was not wearing a coat. She was not wearing a hat. She was not wearing gloves. She was wearing a nightdress and one boot, just one, on her right foot. The other foot was bare and blue, and she was standing in the snow in that one boot and one bare foot, and she was leaning against the porch post because she could not stand on her own. Her lips were the color of ash. Her eyes were open, barely. Please. That was the only word. Marguerite did not think. She scooped the child up. She turned around. She kicked the door shut behind her with her heel. She carried the girl to the parlor. She laid her on the rag rug in front of the parlor stove. She began to strip off the frozen nightdress with fingers that were once again refusing to work properly. Della was already at the range. She was pulling the kettle forward. She was pulling down every quilt in the house. She was pulling down the wool blanket from the back of the settee. Marguerite, who is she? Lucinda Trenholm. What? Osgood Trenholm's daughter. Della froze. She stared at her sister across the parlor. Then she looked down at the child on the rug. Marguerite, Della said, very slowly. Not now, Della, not now. Marguerite, that man tried to take our farm. I said not now. Marguerite, Della, if you have something to say to me, you say it in 5 minutes. Right now, I need warm water and every blanket you can find. Go. Della went. But she was not finished. They wrapped the child. They rubbed her arms, her legs, her bare foot, very gently. Not the toes. You do not rub frozen toes. Marguerite remembered that from her father. Frozen toes get wrapped in something warm and dry, and they are left alone, and the body does the rest. The child's foot was not fully frozen, not the whole way, just 3 of the smaller toes. They were white. They were hard. They were not going to be saved. Marguerite could see it. She did not tell the child. The child was starting to warm. She was starting to shake, which was good, which was the body trying to generate heat. Her eyes were open now. They were focused on Marguerite's face. Papa's fire went out. When, Lucinda? When did the fire go out? Yesterday. Mama tried to relight it, but the wood. She could not finish. There is no more wood. The child nodded. Where are your parents? Home. Mama cannot walk. Her feet. How far did you walk? The child looked at her. 2 full miles, in a nightdress, in one boot, in -46. Marguerite closed her eyes, then she opened them. She looked at Della. Della was standing in the parlor doorway. Della's face had gone through several changes in the last 5 minutes. First hardness, then doubt, then something else. Something Marguerite recognized, because it was the same look their mother used to get 30 years ago when she was about to do something the family would remember for a generation. Della said, very quietly, how long will it take us to reach them? An hour, if we hurry. Longer if the drifts have moved. Both of us, we will need the sled. Della, that man called you names. In your own yard, in front of me, and I heard him. I know. And now you want to. Della, if we do not go, they die. Do you understand? His wife dies. He dies. This child's father dies. And this child sits in our parlor for the rest of her life, knowing that we let it happen because we were angry. Now go get your coat. Della did not move. Marguerite stopped. She realized she had been shouting. She had not shouted at Della, not once in 2 years, in any of the 2 years since Della had come back to the farm as a woman instead of a girl. Not through the digging, not through the ribs, not through the ribbon hat courthouse day. She had shouted just now. She took a breath. She let it out. Della, please, get your coat. Della's eyes filled, but she went. They wrapped Lucinda in the wool blanket. They laid her on the settee. They banked the parlor stove as high as it would go. They shut every door in the house. The sled was in the barn. It was Wendell's old hauling sled, 6 feet long, 2 runners, a rope loop at the front for pulling. They roped it behind them, both of them pulling. They went out of the yard, down the lane, onto the section road. The road was gone. There was only white. The wind had erased everything. The fence posts were the only landmarks, and even those were half buried. They walked in the middle of what had been the road, and they leaned into the wind, and they did not speak, because you cannot speak in a 46 below wind. The moon came out at one point from behind a rolling piece of cloud, and the whole valley lit up, blue and white and black. It was the most beautiful thing Marguerite had ever seen, and also the most terrible. Because if the moon went behind the cloud again, they would lose the fence posts. And if they lost the fence posts, they would lose the road. And if they lost the road, they would die out here. Della fell twice. Both times Marguerite got her up. The second time Della set into Marguerite's shoulder, in a voice that was thick with cold and exhaustion. Marguerite. What? Do not let me go. Do not let go of me. I will not, Della. I will not. Do you promise? I promise. Oh. They kept walking. They reached the Trenholm house at midnight. The house was dark. Not one lamp burning. Not one column of smoke rising from the chimney. Marguerite understood then why the child had come. There was no fire. There was no light. There was no warmth. There was quite possibly no life. She kicked the door open. She had to. It was frozen shut. Inside, the air was as cold as the air outside, or nearly, because they had let the fire go, because they had run out of wood, because Osgood Trenholm, who had lived on this section for 31 years, had not laid up enough firewood for a real Minnesota cold snap, which said everything about Osgood Trenholm that Marguerite had ever suspected, and more. She found the wife first, in the front bedroom, under a pile of quilts, alive, barely, both feet frozen. She would later lose 2 toes on one foot, and part of a third. She found Osgood in the parlor, on the floor, in front of the cold stove, alive, barely. Della, get the quilts, load the wife, first, then him. Marguerite, he is heavier. Load the wife first. If we lose one, it will not be her. Della did not argue. They loaded Mrs. Trenholm onto the sled. They wrapped her in 3 quilts. They tied her with rope. Then they came back for Osgood, the 2 of them, dragging a 200-pound man from the parlor of his own house, through his own doorway, out into a wind that could kill him in under 2 minutes, across a yard, to a sled, where they laid him on top of his own wife. Marguerite stood back for a moment. She looked at the sled, nearly 400 pounds of load, to pull 2 miles in a 46 below wind by 2 women. Della saw her looking. Della said, very quietly, Marguerite, 1 rope, 1 step. That is how we do it. Della, 1 rope, 1 step, go. They went. The walk back took 2 hours and 10 minutes. Marguerite would not remember most of it. She would remember the sound of the runners on the packed snow, the ache in her shoulders, the way her thighs had begun to shake around the halfway point in a way that made her afraid she was going to sit down and not get back up. She would remember one thing above all. She would remember Della, in front of her, in the traces, her back very straight, her breath coming in short, hard clouds. And she would remember thinking, somewhere around the last quarter mile, in a voice that was not quite her own, if we live through this, Della, if we live, I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you. They reached the yard at 2:40 in the morning. They dragged the sled into the woodshed, because the woodshed was closer than the house, and they lifted the hatch, and they carried Mrs. Trenholm down the 8 earth steps. First, because Marguerite had promised, and they laid her on the packed floor, on a bed of quilts, in a room. That was 42 degrees. Then they went back up, and they got Osgood, and they carried him down, and they laid him beside his wife. And Margaret Ashwood, who had not sat down in 8 hours, sat down, on the top step of a cellar, under a woodshed, and she put her face in her mittens, and she wept. Della sat down beside her. Della put her arm around her sister's shoulders. Neither of them spoke, for a long time. The Trenholms stayed in the cellar for 3 nights. Marguerite fed them broth and warm potatoes and soft cornbread. She brought heated stones from the range wrapped in flannel and slid them beneath their quilts 1 every 2 hours all through the first night. On the second night, in the lamplight of the cellar, with his wife asleep beside him, Osgood Trenholm turned his head. He looked at Marguerite. He looked at her for a very long time, as if he had never really seen her before. And in a way, he had not. He tried to speak. He could not. He tried again. Miss Ashwood. Yes. I do not. You do not have to say it, Mr. Trenholm. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not this year. If you need to say it, you will know when. He closed his eyes. A tear ran down the side of his face, into his ear. He did not wipe it away. He said, very softly, I had a son, once, 2 years ago. He died, of pneumonia. 28 years old. He was my only boy. His name was Alden. He was going to inherit my farm. And when he died, I did not know what to do with myself, so I began to want other people's farms, as if that would fill it. I do not know why. I do not know why I did what I did to you. I only know I am ashamed. I am so ashamed that I do not know how to look at you. Marguerite sat on a stool in the corner of the cellar. She did not answer him for a while. Then she said, very quietly, Mr. Trenholm, my husband died in the spring of 1930 of pneumonia. He was 34. I have not known what to do with myself either. For a while I let it make me hard, which was maybe not the best thing, but it kept me standing. So I understand what you are telling me, and I forgive you. But that is because I need to, not because you have earned it. You will have to earn it yourself for the rest of your life. Do you hear me? He nodded. He was crying. She let him cry. So she got up. She climbed the 8 earth steps. She left him alone with his wife. The cold broke on the 25th of January 1932. Not suddenly, it never breaks suddenly. But by the morning of the 26th, the porch thermometer read 15 below, which felt after 14 days at 48 like a spring afternoon. The Trenholms went home on the 27th in their own wagon, which Marguerite hitched up herself, with Lucinda in the wagon bed wrapped in a quilt, and Osgood on the seat, and his wife beside him. At the yard gate, Osgood stopped the wagon. He climbed down, slowly. He took off his hat, he said, in front of his wife and his daughter and his God. Miss Ashwood, when the spring comes, if you would have me, I would like to learn how to build a room like the one under your woodshed. If you would teach me, I would be honored. Marguerite looked at him, she thought, for a long moment. Then she said, Mr. Trenholm, yes, I will teach you. I will teach anyone who asks, on one condition. Name it. When someone else, someday, comes to you and needs to know, you teach them and you tell them that the only price is that they teach the next one down the road forever, until the last winter this country ever sees. Do you agree? He looked at her. He nodded. I agree. He climbed back into the wagon. He drove home. Spring came. Osgood came back, and Marguerite taught him for the whole month of May. I was 52 years old, and he had never dug a hole deeper than a fence post. And by the end of the month, he had a cellar under his own equipment shed that would hold, because Marguerite had made sure it would. Emmett Ronvik came too. She taught him. Then the Hallorans came. She taught them. Then a family named Kroll. Then a family named Sundgren. She taught them all. She never took a dollar. Over the years that followed, cellars like Marguerite's spread quietly through the valley. From farm to farm, from hand to hand, nobody kept account. Nobody wrote it down in a newspaper. It was passed the way all real knowledge is passed, between people who had needed it and people who might need it next. And the cold snap of January 1932 was not the last hard winter that Valley would see. But when the hard winters came, cellars held, families ate, cows lived, because a widow named Marguerite Ashwood had taught a neighbor, who had taught another, who had taught another, who had taught another, because that was the price. That had always been the price. Della stayed for 3 more years. She learned to farm. She learned to plow. She learned to milk. She learned to shoot a rifle badly. She never got much better with the rifle. She would laugh about it later. She left in the spring of 1935. She moved to Duluth. She opened a small tailoring shop on Superior Street. She met a widowed carpenter named Ellis Fay. He had 2 children from his first marriage. Della raised them. Della had 2 more with him. She lived a long, full, ordinary life, which was, she said, the greatest gift her sister had ever given her. She wrote to Marguerite every week. For 41 years, her last letter, written 6 days before her own death, ended with these words. Remember the ribbon hat, Marguerite. We wore the ribbon hat. And we walked out of that courthouse, and we were not afraid. Marguerite kept farming the 90 acres until 1948. She sold it that spring to a young couple from Wisconsin. They were kind. They were unprepared. They found the cellar in their second winter. And they wrote to Marguerite. She wrote back a short letter. It ended with the words, the earth remembers summer longer than we do. Do not be afraid to teach it to your children. It is not mine. It never was mine. It belongs to whoever will take the time to listen. She moved to Duluth to live near her niece. She died there in 1962. She was 63 years old. Her stone read only, she kept the winter out. In the fall of 1971, a woman in her late 40s, named Lucinda Trenholm Vessel, a school teacher, sat on her front porch with her 7-year-old granddaughter on her lap, and a photograph album open on the small table beside them. The granddaughter pointed at a photograph. A woman standing in front of a woodshed in work clothes, with her hair pulled back, squinting into the sun, her hands on her hips, her sister beside her laughing. "Who is that, Nana?" Lucinda looked at the photograph. For a long time. Then she said very quietly, "That is the woman who saved your great-grandmother's life, and your great-grandfather's life, and mine, when I was 10 years old, in the coldest January anyone in that valley could remember. She and her sister carried us out of a frozen house, on a wooden sled, through 2 miles of wind, and they put us in a room that she had built, with her own hands, under a woodshed. A room under a woodshed. A room where the winter could not reach us. How did she build it? Her father taught her, when she was a little girl, in Canada. Is she still alive? No, sweetheart, she died, when you were a baby. Then how do we remember her?" Lucinda closed the photograph album. She looked out across the lake. The water was gray. The sky was gray. The first flakes of the winter's first snow were beginning to fall. She said, "We remember her by teaching what she taught us to anyone who will listen, because that is what she made us promise. Every family she taught," she said, "the only price is that we teach the next one down the road. Forever." "Am I the next one?" Lucinda looked at her granddaughter. She smiled. "Just a little." She said, "Yes, my darling, you are. You are the next one. So listen close, because the story starts on a July afternoon in an ice house on Lake Simcoe in 1907, when she was 8 years old. When she was 8 years old. Tell me. And on a front porch in Duluth, as the first snow of the season came down, around her granddaughter's small shoulders, Lucinda Trenholm Vessel began to tell the story of a widow and her sister and a woodshed, and a father who had said once a long time ago in a room full of ice, "The earth remembers summer longer than we do. You do not fight winter. You borrow what the ground already has."